here today at the LMU in Munich to interview Peter Adamson and Bligh Somma about their project Animals in Philosophy in the Islamic World. For those who don't know, Peter Adamson is here professor at the LMU for late ancient and Arabic philosophy, and Bligh Somma is assistant professor for philosophy at the Fordham University in New York City. Thank you for accepting to do this interview for IPM Monthly. So you're both at the head of the RC project on animals in philosophy in the Islamic world, in philosophy of the Islamic world. Could you tell us a little bit what are the aims and the questions that the project aims to answer, and also what periods and authors does it contemplate?
Yeah, sure. So we started in 2018, and we've been looking at this, what turned out to be a very large and complicated topic, which is, as you said, animals and philosophy of the Islamic world. And you can kind of divide it into two aspects. So on the one hand, there's maybe the more obvious aspect, which is what you might call animal ethics. Like, how should we treat animals? What role should they play in our lives? Are we allowed to eat them? Can we abuse them as much as we want because they don't have any moral standing at all, etc. The other aspect would be something more like, what are animals? In particular, what are their minds like? So are they capable of the same mental activities as we are? Or are they capable of some of these activities? Like, for example, they can use imagination and memory, but they can't think rationally. These are the two broad philosophical domains that we're looking at, or the two broad questions that we're looking at. And then we wanted to look at a whole range of different texts within the Islamic world that address these two questions, sometimes together, sometimes separately, focusing on what you might call the classical or formative period of Islamic intellectual history, which is something like 9th to 12th century CE, although we've had some work in the project that went earlier and some work that went later than that. That means we're looking at some of the most famous thinkers of the Islamic world. So in particular, we've done a lot on Ibn Sina, who's often called Avicenna, because that was what he was called in Latin. So we've had some postdocs working really almost exclusively on him. But we've also looked at zoological writings, like Ibn Abi Ashaf is a thinker we've looked at, or Jahiz, who's a kind of literary figure who wrote a huge book about animals. We've looked at medical writings and zoology, biology, ethics, metaphysics, right? So it's been quite a wide-ranging project in that sense.
How did the idea of the project come about, and to what extent is the topic of animals particularly relevant for this philosophical context of the Islamic world?
The idea for the project came about insofar as Peter was looking for an idea for a GRC advanced grant, and at the time I was finishing up a dissertation on Ibn Tufayil's Hayy al-Aqsam, and I had been interested in working on animals since before I came to Musaf, and but hadn't gotten to do so on the dissertation. And there's so much material on animals, so I came to Peter and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing something on animals? There's all this material," and he thought that's a great idea. It's super interesting.
Yeah, I think you were standing right there.
Yeah,
you said this.
Yeah, I think so.
So you were like, what about this? I was like, I'm thinking of this and that. And then you said, well, why not just do something on animals?
Yeah, I think that maybe was the exact words I said.
Why do you think that animals is particularly interesting for this context of philosophy in the Islamic world, and how do you justify this?
I think there's like three ways in which animals are particularly interesting for philosophy in the Islamic world. They're interesting in themselves, insofar as philosophers, and not just philosophers, but philosophically inclined theologians, legal theorists, physicians, poets were interested in animals and wrote about animals and thought about animals in themselves. So there's a lot of material. But animals were also useful for thinking about human beings because we're human animals. And so either thinking about us as animals or delineating us away from animals, but also thinking about the universe, seeing how animals relate to the universe, but also are useful for understanding what the universe is. Is the universe like an animal? Is it not like an animal? Is it something that animality is useful for conceiving and understanding. And so I think there's at least those three ways for that make animality relevant.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think more generally there's a sense in kind of the popular imagination that there's really only two phases of thinking about animals in human history, namely before Darwin and after Darwin.
Mm-hmm.
So it used to be kind of in the battle days that animals were thought to be just almost infinitely below humans, completely incomparable. So we have moral standing, like I said, they don't. Right? We can think, they can't. So this is what people would have assumed about pre-Darwinian attitudes towards animals. And then later, once Darwin showed that there are these very close historical connections between us and some animals, people started thinking, wait a minute, maybe animals do matter. So we have a kind of growth in animal ethics. So there's all kinds of ways in which this popular story is wrong. So for example, before Darwin, you have utilitarians already giving reasons for treating animals well. But the thing that we wanted to highlight is that there is also the Islamic tradition, or several Islamic traditions, which go very far in the direction both of thinking about animals as being worthy of ethical attention. So you have texts saying, don't mistreat them, you have to look after them benevolently, the way God looks after us benevolently. And also, and this I think is something that's maybe even unique to the Islamic context, is that it's really a moment where you see them coming to grips with how much overlap there is between animal minds and human minds. That's not really something that you get very much in antiquity. Sometimes you get discussions about whether they can understand language, for example, or whether they could undergo some kind of planning or thought processes. But what you get in a lot of texts of the Islamic world, so Avicenna, Ibn Sina would be a good example of this, he really thinks very carefully about all of the human cognitive powers and says, well, actually, pretty much all of these would belong to animals. The only thing that we can do that they can't do is like abstract intellectual thinking. So this goes back to what Bligh was saying about us being animals as well. There's a nice passage in Ghazali, later thinker, who's talking about Ibn Sina's view on animals, where he says, well, for Ibn Sina, we're basically just animals who can do philosophy as well, but everything else is the same.
And so in a nutshell, what would you say are the main findings and conclusions that you've reached so far in relation to the questions that you posed initially?
Right. Okay. Well, there's a lot because there were like 10 people working on the project, so I probably can't cover this all in such a brief conversation, but maybe one thing that would be interesting to start with would be some work that one of our PhD students, Nicolas Payen, has been doing. His thesis is about early ideas about classifying animals, and also the language that was used to talk about animals, how they were divided. So, for example, into domestic and wild, or predatory and non-predatory, this kind of idea. And one thing that comes across from his thesis, I mean, it's a very complicated story, but one thing that comes across from it is that in some ways they didn't really have a word that meant animal. So there's this Greek word zoon, which we translate animal, which just means living thing. And there's an Arabic word, hayawan, which also gets translated as animal and means living thing. But there isn't like a one-to-one match between the word hayawan and the concept of animal in very early Arabic literature. And so he charts this whole story about how language about animals and different kinds of animals develops in early theology and linguistic treatises and juristic writings, and then also philosophy. And one thing that he's showing there is that the translation of Greek works into Arabic had an impact on the way people talked about animals, even the very words that were used for animals. So there we kind of already see that philosophy and the reception of Greek philosophy in Arabic helped shape people's attitudes towards animals. Then, to return to this issue about animal minds, an example that comes up on a lot of what we've written is that Ibn Sina has this case where a sheep sees a wolf, realizes that the wolf is dangerous, and runs away, which seems unsurprising to us. But if you start reflecting on how is the sheep doing that, traditionally what an animal, a non-human animal, could do is engage with its sensory environment and see and smell and hear, etc. And there's a couple of others, taste and touch. But none of that would explain what the sheep is doing, right? Because the sheep's not going to run from the wolf just because it's gray or because it's making a growling sound. The sheep is running from the wolf because the wolf is dangerous and wants to eat it. And Messina is wondering, how does the sheep manage to do this? And he invents a whole cognitive power that she calls wahm, which is just the power to grasp the properties of things in your environment that you cannot grasp with the 5 normal senses. And then he says that we have this too. So this is actually a case of something Bligh mentioned earlier, that they start changing the way they think about humans because they're thinking about what animals can do.
So there's, I think, actually quite a lot to say about animal ethics during this time period. There was a good amount, I think, of work done on animal ethics during this time, mainly on just a few thinkers, like Abu Bakr al-Razi, the Ikhwan al-Safa, Ibn Tufayl. And so I remember when we started the project, there were some questions about how much more work there was to be done on animal ethics. I think there's a question about whether these thinkers are anomalous or paradigmatic. What we found as we did some digging is that it seems they are in fact more paradigmatic insofar as they are the, let's say, fruition of deeper trends in Islamic thought. If we look not just at philosophical texts or theological texts, but even on very early scientific writing and translations, we find that animal character, what their kind of species-specific traits are like, what sorts of creatures they are, were really at the forefront of a lot of thinkers' minds. And this says a lot about the ways that animals are like us, not just physically, but in what their lives are like. And that brings them into a sphere of ethical relevance. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to treat them in a certain way, but it raises the question. If the horse cares for her young, what is it? Does that mean something for us? Right? If the sheep is upset when her young is slaughtered in front of her, does that mean something for us? That's significant. And in fact, you see these things a lot. And so that, I think, was a pretty significant finding for us, and is something that's much more widespread, I think, than even I was really hoping and I think to some extent expecting to find this, and it is even more widespread than I think I had thought. And we find it in philosophical texts and theological texts, legal texts, and so that was a really exciting discovery.
Was there any unexpected result during the course of the project?
Yes, for sure. I feel like there were probably lots of unexpected results. I think there was maybe one in particular, and one of the later authors who we worked on a lot. Adamson argued that animals could not do this kind of abstraction of intellection. This was reserved specifically for human beings. And Fakhreddin argues extensively for, well, we don't actually have a very good argument for why animals can't do this. And in fact, we have arguments for why we should think that they can intellect universals, just like human beings can. And he says, don't worry, that doesn't mean that they have souls or essences that are identical to human beings, but actually they have much more sophisticated rational capacities, such that we should be able to conclude that their souls are separable. Now, he doesn't necessarily conclude and say, therefore their souls are separable, they're going to the afterlife and so on. He's rather tight-lipped or aphoretic about that, but it's a really kind of breathtakingly positive, say, evaluation of animals' rational capacities, and the most sophisticated, and one that I've seen anyway, of all of our thinkers. And you find it throughout at least 3 of his works, both philosophical and in his Quranic commentary, and there's a real progression in his thought in favor of acknowledging that animals have rational capacities that are in fact very alike and sometimes even better than the ones that human beings have. And I think for me that was one of the most unexpected and pleasant, frankly, results
Yeah.
that we found.
I think something else that case illustrates is how a lot of these things come together. So he's talking about what you might think is a kind of theological question. Do animals get to go to the afterlife? Right? That seems to be the context in which he talks about this. But then he's engaging with Ibn Sina, so philosophy is in there. And then there's all this zoology and biology because he gives specific examples about animal behaviors and what they can do, like the fact that bees build honeycombs in hexagonal shapes. Cells are hexagonal, right? And spider webs, and gives the example of if an animal, a grazing animal, is looking for grass, it's not looking for some specific grass. It's looking for any grass, which shows that they have abstract ideas, right? So it's just looking for grass, not some grass or other. So he gives all of these examples, some of which are drawn from the zoological treatises that I just mentioned, so Jahiz and Avicenna or Ibn Sina. So he's bringing together a lot of the material that we looked at all in one kind of package, and then saying something that is very surprising.
And what was the funniest thing you came across during the project?
Well, so one thing that happened that was funny already during the application process is that when you fill out one of these application forms, there's a question at some point, which is, does your research involve animals? And of course they meant, like, are you going to experiment on animals? And then we were like, should we put yes or no for this? But I think my favorite thing from all this Arabic-speaking literature is an example from an earlier philosopher named Razi. Although, Sarah, you wrote a paper on this and you showed that it's an older example that goes back to antiquity and so on. But it's very charming. So the idea is that there's a mouse and it wants to get in the oil that's inside a bottle, and it can't stick its head in because the bottle's neck is too narrow. So it dips its tail in, gets the oil on its tail, and then licks the oil off the tail. And this is supposed to be an example that proves that animals are capable of planning and something like rational thought. And it's actually in the other Razi too, that we were just talking about. So it's in Abu Bakr Razi, and then it's used again in Fakhruddin Razi.
I think the funniest example that I found, I mean, it's kind of a sad example. It was from early book of uses of animal bodies, and so this is like a manual, almost pharmaceutical ultimately, but it also had like magic potions. And so I was looking at the examples for the bat, and it was if you grind up a dried bat carcass, part of the bat carcass, maybe it was the head, can't remember, and you can make an invisibility potion. You have to be careful because if you speak, then you're found out. So I think that was probably, that's my favorite one.
Yeah.
Actually, one of our postdocs managed to do this.
You don't know, but they're right here the whole time.
Oh yeah, oh yes, of course.
Don't say it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us here.